you, folks. Wow, that's a lot of windows. Well done. So Eric Jackson's from HomeAway, where they have lots of windows through acquisition, and we'll explain how HomeAway is using Puppet on Windows at scale.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
We at HomeAway we have basically a huge acquisition chain of companies that used .NET and Windows development. So we've got roughly 1,000 servers that run Windows that we pulled into Puppet, which I would argue is a lot more difficult than building an infrastructure or designing new with Puppet, is pulling a whole bunch. It wasn't a different or a pre-built architecture. It was a whole bunch of different company thoughts, designs, configuration ideas. Every application had a different deployment model and everything like that. So the two pieces I think we really took advantage of was basically using Puppet to set a base configuration on the Windows side, and then using Octopus Deploy to basically have a single mechanism to push code out with from that point. So this particular kind of talk came about by Austin DevOps Days is really heavily centric on a lot of Linux and certain tools. And I thought that maybe the Windows community and some of the Windows side of things needed some attention. So for those of you Linux guys like Jason, I thought I'd just go over a couple different ways you can set desired state or stateful information on Windows. Puppet is going to be the main focus of this, but another tool that Windows has with Active Directory is group policy. And the thing I like about group policy is it's actually better than desired state in some ways, where you don't just say, like in Puppet, if I say, hey, I want this version of an RPM or a Debian package, someone could come along and change that. Now it'll put it back, right? But they could uninstall it, remove it, do that. With group policy, you can enforce a state. You can say, make it this way and don't let the person change it. So I think there's a lot of aspects from a Windows perspective that are kind of overlooked in terms of, ensuring a known state for things. The other thing that's overlooked is PowerShell desired state configuration, or PowerShell DSC. It's available for Windows and Linux. I do not heavily utilize it right now, but I think that it would be a nice layer in to use with Puppet in certain ways, and in some cases, kind of defining a state configuration that way. Octopus Deploy, again, that's how we push out code. We moved all of these different deployment pieces into a single uniform deployment tool. And Octopus Deploy, I think, is pretty much the premier way to do it in Windows, in my opinion, and it's incredibly cheap. It's like $5,000 for a single node and 20 for clustered. That's a site license. I mean, that's just unbelievably cheap. And it's a company run by the developers that write it. So, I mean, if you tell them a feature or give them an idea, it gets out there the next month. It's pretty ridiculous. It's not a business unit. It's a developer unit. So know what you're getting into. Yeah. But the reason I bring up Octopus Deploy kind of goes back into one of the questions was, with Windows, you have these monthly security updates, right? These security updates come out, and how in the world do you deploy security updates in an automated way and not have an incident or an outage? And one of the ways that I solve that problem with my coworker Heather is we deploy Windows updates as code. So the same mechanism that takes us 1 of 3 or 1 of 40, depending on what application it is, servers out of the load balancer, applies the code for the developers, puts it back in, has QA checks, all that stuff. We actually use that same exact methodology to push code out using Octopus Deploy. So we push the Windows updates to our web servers and our application servers in that way to keep them updated with minimal outage or impact. So just a couple different things besides Puppet we're using that, if you guys are interested, we can delve into. This particular talk is kind of set around conversing with some of my Linux peers in the operations team to show them similarities between how I set things in Puppet and how they set things in Linux, how I set things in Puppet for Windows and how they set things in Linux for the same way, and how we can kind of utilize the same code and how they're pretty close. But as Oliver mentioned, the key piece, and there's some people from Dell that I have met with and talked to about this. The key piece to making Windows work, in my opinion, is the Chocolatey component, which is effectively apt-get for Windows. Okay, it lets you deploy what are NuGet packages, but it's just like a Debian package or a RPM package. It's a methodology to have version control and packages pushed out on Windows. So these common OS types in Puppet, file, service, package, and then I basically say how you have different providers for different Linux distributions depending on what they use. You can also use Chocolatey for Windows, or you can use the Windows default package provider, which is basically MSI. These are mechanisms where you can configure Puppet states or settings for Windows devices very similar to how you would for Linux. So if you're used to one, you could do the other. And again, the way that I like to work is I prefer interruptions or things. So if you ever have a question, just shout it out or raise your hand. So this is just a small code piece I put in.
Package provider. Is Chocolatey the default package provider for Puppet?
So that is a great question. I have a code example of how you change that in later sections, but it is not. The default provider I don't even use, but it's basically an MSI, I think, wrapper. I might be wrong about that, but you want to use Chocolatey. You want to get the advantage of being able to check versions, upgrade, do those kinds of things. This will give you an apt-get type solution for Windows, right? This will allow you to do that. And I have a section where we'll go into kind of the Chocolatey commands and how that works on Windows. Just for the people that aren't familiar with it, it'll give you an idea of how, if you have a Windows laptop or something like that, I recommend you kind of put it on there and use it yourself there. So in this particular case, what I'm showing is the file resource and the service resource. Now this is for a Windows machine, but if anyone familiar with Puppet here besides Byron? If you're familiar with Puppet, the file and service definition should look pretty similar to a Linux definition, right? I specify where I want to check that file. This is an OpsView configuration INI file that tells it what are like acceptable servers and configuration settings that it needs. Puppet is going to ensure that file exists, and it's going to make sure that it matches that source file. So if that file is edited, changed, someone deletes a line, adds a line, on a Puppet run, if it's different, and it'll do an MD5, it'll basically check the hash. If the hash is different, Puppet will replace whatever file's on the Windows system with the one from our Git repo, and it will notify the OpsView service to restart. So if someone comes along on a system, let's say they add a couple different places they want to have like monitoring or event logs set, or they delete something, Puppet will basically put the correct configuration file back on every run that it's been changed. It will notify the service, and then Puppet will basically restart that service so that it reloads the configuration file. And in this case, if you look at, it ensures the service is running, it's set to automatic in Windows. But these are all very similar settings and definitions to what you would do for a service in Linux, if that makes sense to everyone. So I just wanted to show how there's a great overlap in terms of what you can kind of achieve with Puppet on Windows. This one goes back to is Chocolatey the default provider? I left this config. This is from an older Git check-in that I had, but it's a good representation. And I wanted to have that provider equals Chocolatey so people saw that. If you look at the top version, I'm doing kind of something interesting. The first thing I'm doing is I'm basically including the Chocolatey module, which is going to put Chocolatey on Windows. But I also have it set to upgrade Chocolatey if it isn't the latest version. So every time a newer version of Chocolatey comes out, Puppet will basically make sure the Windows server is running the latest version of Chocolatey. The other examples, I have the upgrade the Windows Management Framework, and I basically have bind tools. I don't know if you know this, but you can run bind on Windows, some of the bind tools, just like you can on Linux. So I use dig and other tools, and I just got upset that not a lot of I don't know if any of my coworkers do, so I just pushed it on every server, so it didn't matter where I was. When I got a question, I could make sure the problem from whatever server I was coming from, I could check, as opposed to having to use NSLOOKUP, which was painful. And then the final thing, I use an example of ensure present, just because I want to make sure tree size is basically a Windows tool for basically laying out file usage on a volume. So these are just kind of like examples of different configurations. If you set within Puppet to change the default provider, you don't need that Chocolatey line. But I left this version in just to kind of show people who might be getting started, that's something they would want to do. So I've kind of gone over the basic things of Chocolatey. I can, real quick, we can see if I can. Sorry, you're gonna have to forgive my resolution changes to get this to display. So with Chocolatey, you can do some basic things. You can list the version. You can look at what's installed on the system. You can upgrade, and I can't. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I did a lot of commits today. So if you do a -Y, you know, it'll automatically install it here. I'm almost positive my Git client's out of date. So, you know, you can just kind of run Chocolatey commands, install packages, manage things like that, just as if you were, you know, just like a Linux package manager. It leaves some things to be desired, but yeah, of course. But you know, it's this slide. I kind of put this in here again to like show some Linux people. One of the key things about Puppet is if you list things in a file, you're defining more of an end state, right? Your desired state configuration. So you might say, if you're thinking about programming in a traditional sense, you might say, okay, I got my package, I'll put that first, and then I got my copy my config file, and then I'll run the service. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean Puppet will do those actions in that order, right? Like this is the first thing I learned in Puppet, was very confused because I was thinking a traditional script, right? And it's defining things that need to be, and Puppet will make its best effort to guess the correct order. It's kind of a soft bindings, and if there's no binding, it'll just do it in an order that it kind of comes up with. So you can use these require and before. So you can basically say, this config file requires this package be installed, or this package must be installed before this config file is copied over. You can do the subscribe and notify. So if you saw that service where I upgraded the OpsU configuration INI file, whenever that was upgraded, I notified the service to restart, so it would reload that configuration file. So those are just kind of ways I'm showing people how they could specify order where it may matter. If you're going to add a user to a group or things like that, it'll make an effort to create the group before you add the user to it, but you could have unexpected results if it isn't there. So that's just something to keep in consideration when you're using Puppet. These are, I just threw these in there because these are kind of newer things that I've been doing. Basically, you can see what something will do without actually having it apply. It falls down. There's a Puppet exec option where you can basically execute either commands or scripts or things like that. So that's going to fall over if outside stuff is done in there. It's not really going to know exactly what's done there, but you can do that to kind of get an idea. You can do if you're not familiar with Puppet, Puppet Agent T will basically run through and apply the Puppet configuration, you can kind of pull it against. If you specify the environment, you can pull another environment, which might be a test config or something on that server. And then there's debug in verbose mode. So just whenever I'm testing, I do -T, -D, and -V, and that gives me all the output I need to kind of figure out where I screwed up. I'm using the environment to change the environment. I used to have a setting where I would basically specify in Foreman what environment to apply to a node. But I'm in discussion with Byron after removal of what our long-term solution is going to be. But I don't know. We're using the open source version of Puppet. I don't know if people use the enterprise or the open source version. But with the open source version, I think that Foreman is a great front end where you can kind of use that for feedback. When I've used the Puppet DB, which is their kind of web interface tooling, it just seemed really slow compared to what I could do with Foreman. But it's all personal preference.
Are you using any sort of a state? Oh, sorry. Are you using any sort of state server like the Puppet Master for a service catalog or anything like that?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that question. We have the way that we have it is our servers talk back to basically our Puppet masters, and we're in the process of, we use Hyra in some cases, and I'm looking at changing it so that Hyra will basically use a fact I built for OU. This is a Windows thing, right? You have an Active Directory, you have OUs that servers live in, and OU is kind of what I expect the server's role to be, and one role only. And the idea is that basically the Active Directory will populate the Hyra. The Hyra will basically be generated from that OU fact and basically get what something is. But right now I'm just using a bunch of if statements within Puppet itself. I don't know if that's...
So what I was trying to determine was if you have a group of servers that are related, are they finding each other? Like for instance, just a web server and a database that it's using. Are you using the Puppet Master to have the web server find its database server? Is it pulling its secrets out of Active Directory to connect to the database server?
So the answer to that is no. We're basically configuring the operating system. We're using PUP to configure the base operating system level and the base tools for scripting. The tool I referenced, Octopus Deploy, is how code is set, and within there we have variables that specify within the applications what web and app and database are. And that was primarily from, we had all this stuff that was imported from other companies, and as we went through to upgrade the deployment method, we basically defined it at that point, what it needed to talk to. But it's done in a similar way. I mean, it's the same conceptual idea, right? You define these are web servers, these are app servers, these are database for this particular piece of code or this particular application, and then they kind of work that way. We're just happen to be using the Octopus Deploy to handle the config files for that. Here, I wrote this just to show how like notify package, you can specify, if you specify a package with no particular name or whatever, you can basically, and I put this in my site PP file, the package, the provider Chocolatey, that'll basically be the default setting for anything at that point. So then you don't have to define provider Chocolatey for all your application installs. The notify I use for basically decision making and trees and things like that in the test phase. And then the schedule, this comes down to that whole how do you deploy Windows updates when you have to reboot machines and do things like that. So we have basically 3 ways of deploying Windows updates. I alluded to how we deploy Windows updates as code, where we use the Octopus Deploy server, push Windows updates through, it takes a node out of the NetScaler, updates it, puts it back in, it has either a QA prompt or a timing, depending on what it is, or a test, and basically goes through and can update front ends with no outage that way. The other way is we have our entire dev test and stage environments, which I call the fact that we were 2 people back then. We have a group policy and we push out all those servers to basically be updated and rebooted a certain day of the month, and they're all updated, patched, and lifted in a single stage, except for database and domain controllers. And then there's the Puppet way, where if you look, you can schedule times. You can basically build a schedule in Puppet, and you can do this for anything that you want Puppet to apply or change. But for updates, you basically set a window of when the update can run, and then you basically define what happens. So in this particular case, there's a module. If you're using Puppet for Windows, there's a PowerShell module which lets you call basically PowerShell commands, as opposed to having to do the default exec where you have to specify PowerShell, do all these kind of trickery and escape characters. You can just specify the provider PowerShell, and I found if you call an external script, it solves the whole mess of characters that PowerShell likes that Puppet Ruby-esque languages don't like. So this is just a way that basically we can update servers that meet a classification. So in this particular case, I have a check for if you're a member of an OU, and if you are, then it applies this class. And if this class is applied, then basically from 6 to 8 on Sunday, that time is based on where the server lives, okay? It'll basically run this update script which patches Windows and reboots as necessary. So that's kind of a more granular thing than you could do with group policy, but you'd be building group policies for every OU. In this particular way, you could specify a particular node that might be in an OU with other stuff that you want to do. Or you could split out computers that all may be in the same OU, may have the same function. You could break them out into different scheduled times.
Is this going to common location to pull out your PowerShell script? So you could potentially change your PowerShell script if you need to, do something different in your Sunday update this time? Or is this using a PowerShell script that's embedded in your Puppet module?
So this is using a PowerShell script that's embedded within the Puppet module. Basically, if any of you are familiar, there's basically a files directory, you create that, and then you can reference this location. So this is a subclass of HA software called updates, and then the file, this update file, this install file basically lives within that class. You learn as you go, and there's a lot of stuff I can do with templating and other stuff and remote calls that I think would prevent me from having to do a code push for Puppet to make changes to these things. That's the next logical step. But this has all been a learning experience as basically just taking care of a problem as life goes. This is just showing an example of a group policy configuration on the left, and then our Octopus deploy on the right. Basically, the Octopus deploy piece checks if the software is out there. It'll drain. So the Octopus deploy has to be used. We deploy as if we're deploying code to an application set. It'll drain the server from the NetScaler. It'll basically apply the update, and then it'll basically put it back into NetScaler rotation. So that's the advantage of the Octopus deploy is the same process we have for pushing code out, not interrupting an application's life cycle, is we can basically push Windows updates the exact same way. The group policy, it's enforced, it's set on a broad level for our dev tests and stage environments. And then the Puppet is kind of a more granular methodology to apply updates than group policy, but it doesn't have some of the neat features that the Octopus deploy has. And then I guess the last thing I wanted to close with was I wrote a whole bunch of Windows PowerShell facts. That's how we got started, was we basically threw Puppet on Windows environments and we just started collecting data. So a perfect example is WannaCry, right? So that comes out and I wasn't sure that servers were all up to date or that like we had movement from junior admins. So I created a fact in Puppet that basically showed me the state of if a server was vulnerable or not. And then I basically shared that with my boss, and we were able to basically track progress of, resolution. And we do that for other things, like if someone says, there's a gateway fact, right? Why would you have a gateway fact? Well, we have a virtual gateway, and when one of the Nexus switches was being worked on, we lost 6 Linux servers because they were set to a specific IP that worked. It worked as a gateway. It was the actual IP of the switch, though. Even though there were 2 switches, they didn't have the virtual gateway set. So I quickly checked all the Windows systems to make sure that we didn't have that problem. So, we kind of define things like that. DNS servers, things like that. We just add facts as we kind of have a report or a, reporting the management need. And that's it.
Puppet seems to have this annoying habit that it caches facts. Has that bitten you before? It seems to cache facts for particular clients.
Caching facts. I've had facts misbehave in the sense of my design failure. I wrote one fact for basically update time and didn't realize we had European servers, which had the date in a different format. That was a fun discovery this morning. Things like that. Things that have bit me in Puppet have been the early version when I started using it, 3.7. It would check if Ruby was installed, see that Ruby was installed, then it would uninstall the old version of Puppet if it was there, which was what put Ruby on the system. So I had to write, in the early days of Puppet, I had to write a lot of scripts around the Puppet installer to do checks that I felt the Puppet installer should have done. What I think the end result was, I could tell they were testing in a clean lab, right? And they weren't seeing these kinds of problems. But it seems to me that they've elevated the level they give kind of the Puppet support as of late. So I don't think those problems exist anymore. Things like that. I found some documentation issues, which I would call them as, where modules, basically they auto-generate their documentation, and I've seen some issues where it doesn't quite line up with how the module functions, things like that. But all in all, I'd say that Puppet for Windows is viable at this point.
Do you have any non-domain join servers that you manage?
So the only non-domain join, that brings up a really key point. The way that I push Puppet out is I have a group policy that says if you're added to the domain, you get Puppet, and then Puppet basically lifts itself up, if that makes sense. I do have one class of servers that aren't on the domain, and those are our build servers. And those are trickery, right? It's got Choco, it's got a base level of .NET, build utilities, SDKs, things like that. And we spin that server up, it does a build, and we throw it away every single time. That's what, if I can get your email, I basically want to talk to you about using Docker for.
Yeah, I guess also the other one is around like auto scaling, right? So we've had massive problems with trying to like enforce group policies, where with domain joined auto scaling instances, right? So you don't, basically it would come down to, if it auto scales, we don't domain join it, which means then you end up forcing it to use local group policies. You can still use group policies, but they become local group policies, and then it comes a configuration management challenge of how do you push down those local policies to all those servers. And we typically bake them in, right? So we're typically baking machine images, and we bake in those local group policies to enforce that. And so for us, rolling out those changes, pushing out new images and then updating stacks that way.
Yeah. So the reason that our build servers are not joined to the domain is because they spin up and get torn down so quickly. We found issues with that. It was like, great. I set up this build server. We got rid of all our static build servers. I'm like, this is awesome. And then my coworker, she's like, we have like 150 new semantic licenses like consumed yesterday. And I'm like, that was a pretty big build day. I bet I know what I need to do. So like, security asks for like, AV software on it, but you get an exception. And since you're spinning it up and tearing it down, you kind of get advantages on that. But yeah, there's the caveat to one of the things that I would say about Windows servers versus Linux servers as how they're consumed today in a lot of DevOps environments is ours are cows, right? They are cows. They're applications that were written with the idea that they would be a certain way. But we can use Puppet to kind of take a base image and then get it to closer to what it needs to be, and the Octopus deploy gets the final code piece there. I asked my close friend Randy to come here. We're working. We have a closed source piece of code that we wrote that it's all PowerShell, but basically you can it does spin up. It adds things to SCCM or Puppet, and it was built for a company that had SCCM on Windows and Puppet on Linux. And we got this working for the company, or he got this working for the company, I should say. And we're generalizing it, and the idea is to open source it, but it does solve some of those problems of spinning things up that are not part of a domain or other managed environment. Thank you.
So Eric, so you guys, do you guys carry a SOC 2 at least, I guess, as far as your compliance needs?
So we're a group of acquisitions.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some OUs where I have certain pieces of the Active Directory where those applications are all SOC compliance. We have a separate domain for an entire PCI compliant environment, which, trust me, that's one thing that I think that HomeAway did really well was all the PCI stuff's in a bubble. So we have our SOCs in a bubble and we have our PCI in a bubble. As we're merging with Expedia, I'm not real clear on how that's going to work because I think some of their SOC stuff and some of their PCI stuff may start bleeding over and talking to ours. And I don't know what long-term that's going to be. But Puppet, I think, is a great compliance tool for that because I get this a lot. Like security asked me a question and I'm like, it was that way like 6 months ago. Like it can't change. Like this is enforced in a group policy or this is enforced in Puppet. And I think we might just write reports that just answer the general questions, and just whenever they ask us, we just run that report and it emails them back or something because, yeah, I think it solves a lot of problems. We did have one case where we had a change made and we had no change log for it with a group policy setting probably about 6 months, a year ago. And I think like we started enforcing certain controls on that level, which we have, and then we started using Puppet basically to configure settings, then we could basically enforce compliance that way. I think that's a lot of use cases that I've heard of Puppet being used. It's just it solves security audits and requirements.
So there isn't I guess a built-in or a product yet for Puppet that would essentially provides a GUI that you could plug stuff like that into?
For Puppet that plugs, I don't know the answer to that.
No?
I have some friends at Chef. They have
Inspect,
which I think is a pretty interesting tool, which was probably the way I would lean if I was going that direction. But I don't know if I honestly don't know if Puppet has anything like that.
So it was interesting because a lot of what you were talking about was, you could get the reporting done really easily for the hundreds of servers you got.
The reporting I have, if it's okay, it's really hard for me to talk off of slides, but if I can just kind of show. Yeah, it's hard for me to see. If this is, I had to fix this bug with European times today, so that's probably what that is. But if you these facts, these are kind of facts that I run. So the reporting stuff that I do is so this gets like update status. Windows has 4 places that can actually record if the system needs to reboot because of an update. That's awesome. So like this is a fact that just tells you if a server's in a state that it needs to restart. So it's kind of, I just kind of build facts when the team or I am doing something to kind of check kind of the status of stuff. I don't know. It's really hard for me to see where I'm at. So like this fact basically gives you, you know, status of like IIS servers. Yeah, it is this. Sorry, I can't view my screen while I'm doing this. It's kind of difficult. But basically, I have reports for things like, you know, like OS version. So if we're like having them with Microsoft, you have to pay based on what you're using. So I have a report basically on what version of what flavor we have, if it's enterprise or standard or data center or whatever it is, and how much that costs. So I do reports. I build facts in Puppet based on questions my boss or the director or someone from accounting or security asked me.
That's brilliant.
What's brilliant? The fact that they charge you for a lot of money, or
No,
or
the fact that you built reporting so that you can just, you know, the only thing you need to do next is just say, click this URL and don't ask again, and you're done.
Oh, wait. So if you read the Phoenix Project, it talks about how as you automate and you build these tools, like life gets better. You have more time with your wife. It just sounds awesome. But my boss is in the room, and he and I can tell you, when you solve one problem, they just back the next truck full of stuff up, and like I was smooth sailing. I was smooth sailing in dev test stage and production with my coworker and my boss, and like we're like, oh my God, we are at the point where, wait for this, we can proactively fix things. And then they're like, hey, you're merging with the corp team, right? And it's like, boom. So yeah, it's that kind of stuff. But I will say, I think it's pretty cool when my team will be like, hey, like we have this one problem. If this setting's this way, like we need to fix it. And then I can write something that looks at that registry key, or in a lot of cases, fix it. The other thing is, oh, this is a great hack. Okay, this is one thing I do. Puppet people would probably, Linux guys would probably freak out, but like I write facts and they'll like check features and things like that. But if you look, the fact actually fixes the problem. So it'll say like, oh, like see if SNMP service is there. If it's not installed, if it is installed, great, you're there. If it's not, you know, fix these things. So it'll report that SNMP isn't configured correctly on your system, but it will fix the problem. This is not desired state configuration. This is just a script. But what I found with Puppet is their facts are just PowerShell scripts, so you can have them do automation tasks in a traditional sense until you kind of roll them into a desired state configuration.
Eric, to write a PowerShell external fact like this, all you have to do is just put it in your facts.d folder and then name it .ps1. Is there anything else you have to do?
That's it. I mean, if you put it in the facts.d folder, then it'll run. There's like special folders. I lost my VPN, so I was going to show some form things. But if you look, there's special folders like this is really hard to. There's special folder. Facts.d is one of them. Files is one of them. If I could scroll, I could show you other stuff. But I mean, the point is like certain subfolders in Puppet kind of help you manage and do your stuff. Yeah. But this was all just kind of, I came and I pushed for SCCM because that's what I used to build automation at another company. And Puppet would have been third on my list, SCCM, Chef, and then Puppet. And I'm actually really glad like I did Puppet because I feel like I grew through their learning pain on Windows.
Other than cost, why SCCM versus Puppet?
Why was I asking for SCCM? The reason I use Puppet is because Puppet's what the company had. Byron, who left, he basically provides Puppet as a service to me. I'm trying to learn more and more of the Puppet master configuration side of it, but I got enough on my plate. I'm often told not to take any more on. So like I consume Puppet as a service. That's why I started using Puppet for Windows. We just didn't have anything else and it helped us solve the problem. My old company, similar situation. I was like, hey, I got this crazy idea. Like we could like organize and automate our stuff. And they're like, we're not buying anything. And I looked at the service desk budget, and they had SCCM and enough licenses that I could use them to build all of our VMware infrastructure with SCCM. So I worked with Randy, who isn't here, and we basically automated the entire VMware build environment with SCCM. So it wasn't like I picked SCCM, it's just the tool that I had. So that's the one thing I would say that about DevOps Austin is I really like when people talk about general concepts. Sometimes you guys get into like particular technologies, and I'm like, I don't have that luxury. So I just thought it would be nice to come out here and kind of show you a different way to do it.
Other questions for Eric?
That was outstanding.